Hello, my name is Peter Thomson, and this is the first in a series of interviews that I'm going to be doing with Mike Alfreds, the theatre director. As I said in my introductory talk, the early part of these interviews and talks are going to be focusing on his life. And this very first one is literally from the year of 0 to the time he reaches sort of mid-adolescence. So this is his childhood, really. And I hope you find it interesting.
Afternoon. How are you, Mike?
Peter, very nice to do business with you.
Mike, I thought we could start right at the beginning, as it were. And I'd like to ask you a little bit about your childhood, and if there's any connection between this life that you've led as an adult and your early years.
Well, there must be, mustn't there? I mean, I suppose it's for other people to analyse. But my, I was born in London in Northwest One or something like that in 1934, 6 a.m. in the morning, June the 5th. My parents were sort of rising middle class. My mother came from a big immigrant Polish Jewish family. She was the youngest of 10 children, and they all lived in the Commercial Road, which was a very, very poor neighborhood then, and shared beds. And it was a very disciplined house. They all had to come home for dinner, and they all had to cook. And if they went out in the evenings, her father, my grandfather, was at the door with a watch, checking them in. And my father, funny enough, I never really talked to him about his past, and he never talked to me. He came from a Sephardic, my mother's family was Ashkenazi Jews. My father's family was Sephardic. I think they'd been in England for quite a long time, since Cromwell possibly, up in the northeast, in Northumbria, where there's a big Jewish population. And they were very, well, both my parents were very anglicized. My mother's grandparents were sort of conventionally religious and rather conservative. My grandmother never really spoke English, she always spoke Yiddish. My mother understood Yiddish but didn't speak it, and I did neither. My father had no Jewish background at all, as far as I could tell, but he was very aware of being Jewish, and he always felt he had to behave very properly and correctly with business people because he was. And so that didn't influence my life very much. I guess all my parents' friends were Jewish. And I suppose my childhood friends were Jewish, but friends from school weren't. I learned to read very young. I loved reading, and I absorbed a lot of books when I was very young.
Oh, Mike, can I interrupt? Were you an only child?
I was an only child, yes, and remained so, yeah. And so I don't know whether it was totally ingrained in me or whether it developed or was both, but I got used to being I quite liked being on my own. I didn't have to share my toys with anybody. And so I think I became in many ways quite a private person. I think I still am in many ways. I'm ruining it now a little bit with COVID-19, but there it is. Anyway, so I read a lot. My face was always in a book. I was always curled up in a chair with a book. And my mother would say, "Why don't you do something?" And my father used to say to me, "Your hands were used for more than feeding your face. Come into the garden and do some gardening," which I hated. And I did it very diligently. He adored gardening. He was a real bloke, but nice one. And he loved fishing. He loved gardening. And I think he played a bit of soccer when he was young. I think both my parents left school very young, like 14.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we never discussed ideas or politics. My mother did develop a code of how she thought life should be led, and she would sort of give me instructions. It was always about being very sociable and being very nice and polite to people, and being and pushing myself forward, which was very difficult because I was actually quite shy as a child, and I used to pull away from that a little bit. I went to a local sort of nursery school, which became a sort of prep school. It was a day school. I used to walk about 1.5 miles in those carefree days, all by myself to school, walk home for lunch, walk back to school in the afternoon, walk back in the evening. And nobody ever said, "Don't talk to strangers," or "Be careful," you know. I was well looked after. I felt loved, you know. I lived in a very comfortable, it was a bungalow to start with, because I have to say, we moved out at the beginning of the war. We moved out of London into a village called Cookham in Berkshire, which was about a 30-mile drive from London. And I remember very little of my life prior to that. I have sort of little images of myself in one of those large sort of block flats, you know, with large rooms. And I think the outside windows were nice and the inside ones looked onto an inner well. And I have practically no memories, actually. I remember there was a porter with a moustache and a uniform who kept frogs in the, what do you call it, it's not, what's the downstairs bit outside of a flat? The landing? No, not the landing. There's a word for it. Anyway, and I was shown those once, but I really cannot remember very much about the first 5, almost 6 years, actually. And so I really grew up in the country, and that was very pleasurable. It was very peaceful. I don't quite know how it happened, but I got interested in horses. I started horse riding. I don't know why. Maybe my mother thought it was a good thing to do because some other children were doing it. So I went to a very grand riding school near Ascot, at Bray, I think it was. I think Princess Margaret and Princess Elizabeth at that time had ridden horses there. And when I was about 10 or 11, my uncle bought me a pony. And I used to ride this pony out into the country all by myself. I could go through woods, I could go through fields. It was so free. It was quite wonderful. And I developed this sort of symbiotic relationship with this animal that I only had to think which direction I went in, and it went. And then occurred a whole series of, you know, children's tragic stories of animals. It was kicked by another horse. We were both walking in a paddock. It was kicked in the leg and its leg was broken, had to be shot. And then my father brought back another horse, which was far too big for me. It was an Arab, grey roan. It was huge and terribly strong, and I couldn't control it. It was ridiculous. My father, by the way, was obsessed with animals. He never looked after them, but he was always bringing them home. I mean, we had goats and we had turkeys and we had bandits and we had chickens. We had a monkey for about 3 weeks, and dogs and cats and a goat. And we used to walk the goat and the dog on a shared lead, and and rabbits. And so then they got me another horse, and it had to stay in a separate field. And the Arab horse was called Tommy, and this new horse was called Flicker. There you are for imagination. And my friend Flicker, which was a great movie at the time, I think. And some kids apparently threw fireworks at it and it became bridle shy, so that was got rid of. And I finally had another pony, which stayed with me for quite a few years until I went to public school, went to boarding school, and they sold it.
Can I stop you for a second and ask? An only child, your mum and dad, but were there lots of family that would come in and visit?
My mother was the youngest of a huge family, so at that time there were lots of aunts and uncles and cousins and second cousins. But it was a family that was always arguing with each other. And my mother, it's very interesting, she didn't want to lead the life she saw her siblings doing. And she sort of got away quite young. My father had 4 aunts who were sort of actually I must have been quite wealthy, although he never seemed to participate in any of that, who were very eccentric and extreme. Yeah. And forgotten the thread of what I was going to say now. Yes, one of the aunts had a fashion business. Uh-huh. And my mother admired her tremendously. Her name was Aunt Maudie. And so she went into the fashion business, actually as a milliner going into a salon where they made hats, and trained. And eventually she had her own business. She had her own showroom, shop, whatever you want to call it, in Bond Street, in Mayfair. And she was quite successful. And she felt that she wanted to push herself up in the world and live in a nice style and have good things. And they were very important for her. Mm-hmm. She was very much of this world, very worldly. There was no spiritual life in our family whatsoever. Mm-hmm. I was a sort of dreamer. And I think both my parents weren't quite sure what they'd caused to come on earth, because I didn't quite fit in.
Can I ask, you said about reading a lot.
Yeah.
Can you remember any of those, 5 to 10-year-old books?
Now considered very politically incorrect, Dr. Dolittle books. I read them and reread them and reread them, and I laughed and I adored them. And I would always, I had a lot of catarrh when I was a child, so often I'd get colds and things. And I was very adenoidal as a child with a blocked nose. So I was often in bed because you got put to bed then. And the nicest thing was to have a couple of days in bed reading Dr. Dolittle with an actual wood fire in the bedroom and being brought food. So it was all very lovely. And so I read a lot of the William stories. The Hobbit, not the Lord of the Rings, but the Hobbit, which I adored. And I don't know, I just kept reading. And very early on, I read the Rupert Bear little stories, which were little yellow books and they were rhymed. And I tried to read Arthur Ransom, but couldn't get into them somehow. They didn't quite speak to me. And there must have been other odd books that I read lots of books about myths and things like that. And I remember a book I had called Children of Other Lands, which absolutely fascinated me. And and then I started to read more adult. I tried to read classics. I was given all the Dickens and all the Jane Austen. And the Jane Austen I read a bit, but I couldn't read the Dickens. I just couldn't, no way whatsoever. But I read Daphne du Maurier, and I sort of got through a lot of, and then I started reading, I was much older, Somerset Maugham, all his novels, his short stories and so forth. And from a very early age, I went to the cinema, and I don't know quite why. And I was absolutely fascinated in the actors, and I think I wanted to be an actor. Before I went to public school, I went to a very good grammar school in a lovely town called Marlow. It was 2 train rides away in Buckinghamshire, across the river. And I read very well. I was very good at reading out loud, and I got cast in a play. It was called Lady Precious Street. It was written by some Chinese guy, and it had been written in the 30s. And I played somebody's mother. Madame Huang, and I had to learn to mince, in Chinese style. And I was very clumsy, rather large, ungainly child. Anyway, I did that, and I got cast in another one-act play, and then I was going to be cast as Jaques in As You Like It. And unfortunately, I was hitting 13, and my bar mitzvah date coincided with the date of the production. And as the bar mitzvah was not going to move itself, I never got to play Jaques. Oh yes, no, before that, I was in Arms of the Man, Bernard Shaw play, and I played the heroine, Raina. So I, and and so it was very nice to get out of, to stop my transvestitism and play Jaques, but that never happened. I then, because my mother felt she was very upwardly mobile or in intention, and I was very happy at that grammar school, and it was a good one, and it was nice, and the education was nice, and she felt I should go to public school. So I went to a public school in Berkshire. It was called Bradfield, and they were very famous for having a very authentic replication of a Greek theatre, which they still have. But I never got cast in anything. I was too young for the Greek plays, and then at some point I got very self-conscious as I hit my mid-teens, 15, 16, and so forth. So but I still was fascinated by films and also simultaneously with this, and again I don't know why, because my parents weren't theatre goers. My father was certainly not. My mother used to go and see smart plays like Noel Coward stuff, but I started going to the theatre at about 11 or 12 in the West End, and I went to the theatre endlessly till I was 18. So
who was taking you to the theatre when you were 12?
My mother would take me, or I'd go with friends. Yeah.
And you could afford it, and I mean,
well, I don't know. I mean, the amazing thing, when I had no money, I could sit in the front stalls. It was 15 shillings front stalls, but who knows? And anyway, to leap back a little bit, at the age of, I was a year ahead of my class, and so I took what was then called my school cert at 15. And then in 2 years' time, I would have taken my, my higher certificate or whatever it was. But then I was getting bored at school and didn't really know what I wanted to do. And so I left school when I was just 16, literally just after my birthday. And I went to stay with a family in France for the whole summer, for about 6 months, in a village in Normandy. And I was very good at languages. I was very good at French. And so by the time I came back, I spoke very, very good fluent French. I really did, with a very good accent. And then my secret ambition was to have something to do with theatre. Having decided I wanted to, I'm sorry, I can't do these things in total sequence. While I was at, I'm just trying to think. I did keep it on a bit of acting. So I left school, went to France, came back, and there was discussions that maybe I should become a lawyer because that was a nice thing. And I was going to be articled to a solicitor who was a friend of the family. And for some reason, I have no knowledge of it, didn't happen. And I eventually, through my mother, who had contacts, I got a job as a trainee managerial guy at Marks and Spencer, which was very highly thought of at the time. And they'd never taken anybody so young, because at that time the national service still existed. There was still a draft, for 2 years. So at the age of 16 and a half, I went to work for Marks and Spencer, and I went through all their training process, going through the storerooms, working on the floor, selling, and so forth and so on, and looking after departments, sort of slightly high-class runaround gopher. And I sort of loved it, and it taught me a lot, because at that time the business was so efficient, so organized. They knew what they were doing. They've always been accused of being very paternalistic, but they did look after their staff wonderfully. and there were great Christmas parties, and you had very cheap, very good food in the canteen. And I started off in my local town, Maidenhead, Theresa May's place, yeah. And then I got moved up to Hammersmith. My parents separated when I was just about 14, while I was at boarding school. And so my mother kept the house in the country. My father found a one-room flat in Notting Hill Gate. And so when I went to Hammersmith, I'd stay with him in the week and go back to the country in the weekend. And before that, when I'd been working at Maidenhead at M&S, I joined a dramatic society, yeah, a local amateur group. And I acted in 2 plays. One was a Christopher Fry play called The Boy with the Cart. And it was in rhyme. And we had 1 performance. And all I can remember was twisting words around in the wrong sequence. I think I was nervous through the whole performance. I don't know how I got through it. And the local reviews said I fulfilled the role satisfactorily. And you know, there's a line rolling like a stone down a hill, and I got rolling like a hill down a stone, and things like that, and they just echoed in my mind. And it's about a boy who dragged his mother to some hermitage or on a pilgrimage to get her cured. And I remember this rather heavy woman had to drag her around in the cart, and I was such a klutz. I was a very incompetent, clumsy child. And anyway, I got through that. Then I was in a J.B. Priestley play called The Burnham Grove. Well, I had to be a young sort of young gadabout boy in a sort of provincial town who was flirting with the local barmaid. And the review said that he was wearing his watch, which was not in the period. He was wearing a wristwatch, you see.
Yeah.
But I was feeling that it wasn't for me. I was very self-conscious. It was wrong. And I was reading then, instead of reading novels, I was reading masses and masses and masses and masses of plays. Really reading a lot of plays. And in my mind, I was thinking, that's what I'm going to be. Not an actor, I'm going to be a playwright. In some drawer in Heaven or Hell, there's a lot of Mike Alfred's scripts. Act 1, Scene 1, a living room with French doors opening onto a garden. And I started lots of things, but I had no idea where they were going. And, I look back on them now, but I was trying, and obviously I was copying. And I adored Noel Coward, and I laughed a lot, and I was totally influenced by that sort of world.
Can I stop you? Because just stop you for a second. Two things I want to ask. Number one, is there anybody from your childhood, and especially maybe your adolescence, that you are still friends with?
No, I lost touch. There was a very close friend of mine. He was 6 months younger than me. It was a boy called Clifford Elkin, who became quite a successful young actor on television in the 50s, I guess. He was at RADA and left early. But over the years, he moved up to Scotland, and I went abroad and worked abroad, and we lost contact, and we did talk to each other by chance about 4 years ago. And I forgot about him. And every time I've been working up in Scotland, I've always forgotten to try to make contact. I mean, he could be dead by now, who knows? Mm-hmm. Anyway, no. And there was another friend when I went to public school who I kept in touch with for quite a while. But again, after about 25 years ago, we just lost contact. Mm-hmm. Again, it was me not making the effort to keep up with people. I always used to let people do the running. People used to call me and say, do you want to go out? Do you want to do that? So no.
But then the next question I wanted to ask is, I mean, reading a play is actually a tricky thing to do, because you have to fill in so many sort of gaps, don't you? Which the playwright has not supplied you with. Why did you get so interested in reading plays?
Theatre, from doing those plays and reading the plays, and a mixture of going to films, wanting to act, going to the theatre a lot, watching plays a lot. I mean, I didn't know how to analyze them. I treated them all very realistically. I didn't realize that things could be symbolic and metaphorical and so forth. It was a totally non-intellectual, totally instinctive reaction. It was about people and actors and performance. That was the thing. Oh yes, the sets were lovely and it was all very glitzy and, you know, and smart West End stuff and beautiful revivals with very classy actors in beautiful period costumes mainly. But I don't know, I think I must have visualized them. I read hugely. And the sad story is that now I can hardly read a play. I find them so boring. I get impatient within 2 pages. It's very odd. It's a labor. It's not a labor of love. It's just a labor. It's hard labor for me to pick up a play and read it.
But are you talking, because let me ask you this first. You're reading all these plays as an adolescent, you know, from 15, 16 onwards. Are they all contemporary plays or plays within 50 years of your life, or are they the Greek?
Probably mainly contemporary plays, lots of light comedies and things which don't exist anymore. I know I used to get little collections, you know, 5 modern plays, you know, which would span from Edwardian up until the 30s or something like that. And so there were Edwardian plays. I think I read some Pinero and, you know, and people of that ilk. But Patrick Hamilton, I thought his plays were I never saw them, Gaslight and Duke in Darkness and Rope. I read those and they were just wonderful. Mm. Yeah. I've still got copies of Terence Rattigan, you know, from the 30s. Mainly plays in the 30s, early 40s, obviously, because we are talking about the 1940s into the very early 50s.
Right, okay. But you're not reading Euripides or Sophocles or Shakespeare?
Chekhov, no, and absolutely not. Shakespeare, I couldn't, like Dickens, I could not read him. I just found him boring, incomprehensible. I didn't know what was going on. Unlike some children who immediately catch on and just, you know, transformed by him when they're 2. You know, no, it's taken me many years. Absolutely. No, Ibsen, no. I mean, none of the people that I absolutely, you know, revere and adore now. No, absolutely not.
And you said you did Arms and the Man. Did that lead you to reading other journals?
Yes, I did read Shaw, but I did find him very difficult because first of all, there was huge introductions, which I kept thinking about the play. And of course, the play was peripheral to the ideas. I did read a lot of his farces, his one-act plays, which were very, very funny. Yeah. Poison, Passion and Petrification. You know, really slapstick, silly plays, and the music here, wonderful. You know, and I did read others and like them more or less. Yeah.
Okay, and just you know, you talked about those plays. It just occurs to me, Mike. You know, you listen to a lot of music. I like music. I mean, was music there from an early age?
Yeah. Yes, I listened to pop songs of the period. I had a record. I had a wind-up gramophone, and then we had one of those wonderful. What was it called? Decagram. It was where, you know, you still had hard, you know, 10-inch for vinyl. No, not vinyl. Things that broke, you know, before vinyl. Bakelite, you know, they cracked, they broke, but you could play. They dropped. You know, you could stack them and they drop and go plop and crash, and you know. So we eventually moved to that, and I adored. I'm sorry, I'm looking at email coming in. I adored musicals. At some point, when I was 13 or 14, I suddenly clicked onto people who wrote wonderful lyrics. I remember being at my public school and hearing on somebody else's radio, Anything Goes, and that Cole Porter, and thinking, oh God, that melody is so extraordinary and it's so tricky because it goes up and down and the words are so wonderful. And so I became besotted, and I would plead with people to bring me, you know, these sets of musicals, if they could, from New York or America. And I had, you know, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes and South Pacific and Kiss Me Kate and so forth. And I'd listen to them, and I could sing every word of every song of a whole show. You know, I still remember quite a few. But one of my cousins, woman, adored classical music, and she used to encourage me. She'd talk to me. She'd tell me stories about, you know, classical pieces. There's a Saint-Saëns thing called, I think it's called Rondo and Capriccioso, and it's very perky. And she said he got the idea from watching a drunk man walking down a staircase. So, and I saw Fantasia, you know, the Walt Disney thing, and I adored all that music. I adored it, you know. But I found, you know, Bach, Beethoven, even Mozart heavy going. I didn't, you know, I wasn't very, I stayed, I was sort of light middlebrow. I think I was very middlebrow as a child, and like smart plays and, you know, sort of fashionable things. And this is my mother's influence, obviously, because she inhabited that world, you know, fashion and going out to restaurants in London and so forth. And I had a little bit of that. So my father, none of this, nothing like, no, you know, and he would be sort of digging vegetables. And
Mike, we've kind of got you in my head to about 16. You're at Marks and Spencer's. You've moved to Hammersmith. You spend the week with your dad. Then you go back to your mum. And this might be the end of this section of our video. Okay.
I hope you enjoyed that first episode in Mike's life. And if you did enjoy it, please put a like there. And if you'd like to, it would be great if you could subscribe. If you subscribe, you could also press that bell button, which will then alert you to when I put up the next video. So that was about his childhood, that one. And the next one will be about national service, Singapore, and, well, you'll have to wait and see. All right, thank you.